So in the last segment, I mentioned, among other things, that George Wallace had pulled off the blue-collar workers. And by blue-collar, of course, I mean the working class, not your white-collar, but your blue-collar, people that get their hands dirty. That George Wallace had pulled off blue-collar workers from the Democrats, but these are workers who would have been appealed to, most likely, by Richard Nixon, and were in later elections, and would be by Ronald Reagan, the so-called Reagan Democrats. And I also mentioned the regional realignment of politics that has begun in the United States by the 1968 election, and what's happening with the South. What I want to do in this segment is explain a little bit further, at least one sort of idea of what's going on, what's behind this shift. And I'll try to be somewhat brief, so feel free to read more about it once some of these basic ideas are out in the open. First of all, we need to talk about one element of Richard Nixon's bid for the presidency, which was the so-called Southern strategy. Okay, the Southern strategy. In essence, what Richard Nixon's doing and what he did, when I say that he hit on many of the same ideas as George Wallace, where Wallace went around the country and sort of started the fire. He didn't start the fire. There was a good bit of anger in the United States over the way things had been going in terms of the protests and the hippies and all that you've talked about in another lecture. That Middle America was starting to get a little upset. I think that's fair. But what Wallace would do is he would go and he would throw gasoline on the fire. Dan Carter, Wallace's biographer, is referred to, he uses a title, Politics of Rage. This is anger. Richard Nixon is not being as overt. He's speaking a more subtle language, a more subtle rhetoric. The idea is basically the same. He's appealing to the same emotions. He's appealing to the same sense of fear and paranoia in the middle class about the changes that seem to be overwhelming the United States. But Nixon's not out there really, he's not so much throwing gas or throwing fuel on the fire. He's out there taking advantage of the fire. He's offering a more subdued, reasoned way to say we're mad without actually acting mad. I don't know if that makes the least bit of sense, but what I'm trying to get across is Nixon benefited in many ways from the fires that Wallace stoked. So what that does, in my mind anyway, is it sort of ties together the political ideas of the 68 Republican candidate with those of this Southern independent conservative candidate. They're expressed very differently. The aims may be quite different, but in some ways they're feeding off the same dissatisfaction or disaffection that exists in the United States by the late 1960s. The Southern strategy is a reflection of that. As Richard Nixon and the Republican Party began to think that as they emerge in this conservative, with these conservative ideas, they can find support in the traditionally conservative South, that they can begin to break in politically to what had been a Democratic bastion. Now, to see then what's going on in the South, we need to turn around and actually look at the South. And there's a phenomenon that's beginning. You can see the origins, the roots or foundations of this phenomenon in the 1960s. Because what's going to emerge across the southern swath of the United States, lower 48, what's going to emerge will come to be known as the Sun Belt. And I guess the most iconic element of the Sun Belt, or iconic elements of the Sun Belt, would be the sort of glass skyscrapers of cities like Houston, Texas, the massive urban growth and development, and the development of sort of the suburban South. Now, a lot of this suburban growth is actually the result of federal dollars. For one thing, the interstate system will have an effect in the South, but so will housing policies. Mortgage protections, the availability of credit for home buyers will encourage suburban growth, but so will defense contracts in the midst of the Cold War. And I just have a series of questions that I often ask students here. If you go back to the Second World War and you think, well, where shall we locate our training bases for the military? The South makes a lot of sense. Relatively warm climate, rural areas available. You can train. You've got a difference of topography. What about growing food? Well, the South makes sense. And by the South here, I don't just mean the old traditional Southeast. Let's spread it out here. Let's look toward the South. The Southwest, the Southeast, or for you all, let's see. Southwest, Southeast. So yeah, Southwest, Southeast. At any rate, if you look, you see the South. That broad swath across the lower 48 southern states. You start thinking about all that comes through these southern states, though. Military bases, that's one thing. Think about the growth of food out in California. Crops like cotton are being replaced post-World War II. These cotton crops in the southeastern, the old South, are being replaced by soybeans and corn. And then you start thinking about the interstates, and I suggested that. Well, where are you driving to? Where are you going? Well, let me suggest this question, and I think this is a kicker. Where's Disney World and where's Disneyland, which was actually constructed first? One's in California, one's in Florida. I mean, who would have thought about coming south to vacation, especially the lower South, places like Florida, until the 1920s? But you think about Orlando, it's fairly, kind of swampy-ish, very humid. And yet, here come Americans by the thousands and thousands to visit Disney World, just as they came to visit Disneyland. And let's go a step further. Where would you find Cape Canaveral, where NASA is launching rockets and later, of course, would launch shuttles? When astronauts got into trouble, what did they say? They didn't say, hello, New York, we have a problem. They said, hello, Houston, we have a problem. Well, Houston, it's in Texas. It's in that southern tier of states. The Marshall Space Flight Center, Huntsville, Alabama. Simi Valley, the technological work that's going on out in California. You start thinking about where the emphasis is being placed, both in terms of tourism, but also in terms of demographic movement and defense contract expenditures during the Cold War, and you begin to see something fundamental happening in the southern tier of states that includes that old southeastern portion, the older South, the Confederate South. One of the things that makes this possible, oddly enough, something we've grown extraordinarily used to in this country, is air conditioning. Nobody wanted to live in the humidity. Well, some people did, but let's put it this way. I wouldn't want to live in the humidity of sort of Florida or Louisiana, southern Texas, if I didn't have air conditioning. It's just not going to happen. I would be extraordinarily uncomfortable. I've had too many occasions where I've walked out at 7:30 in the morning someplace in the South and have a shirt, it's kind of where the humidity is already so high in the early morning hours. What's happening across the United States, not just in the South, but across the United States, think about it, is the growth and development of suburbia back in the 1950s. It's a post-World War II phenomenon to the degree that it happens. Now, suburbia is older than World War II. We go all the way back to the 19th century easily. But World War II, post-World War II, as the veterans return, you have a new kind of suburbanization, the small home, the idea of the American dream, right? Levittown, or the Levitt towns, actually. mass-produced housing for the masses. Outside the city, we're not talking about apartment complexes, we're talking about home ownership. So you got to ask the question, if you could do that in New York, if you could do that around Chicago, why couldn't you have suburbs around Atlanta? If suburbs are all so much alike in their character, what's going to be the difference between an Atlanta suburb with air conditioning and a suburb around Chicago or Detroit? And the answer is not much. What Richard Nixon is doing here is beginning to build upon the changes that are taking place in the South. And it's not just the Southern strategy is not just about reaching out to the South. Remember, it's part of this larger goal of reaching out to Middle America and the middle class. Well, where is the middle class? Increasingly, the middle class is living in suburbia. And that could be in the North, but it could also be in the South. It could be in the West. There's a certain sameness about suburbia. Okay. So that's a big part of the Southern strategy. Another element, though, of the Southern strategy is that the sense of dissatisfaction is not merely in the South, but it's spread out around the United States. It's in suburbia itself. By 1970, more people in the United States lived in suburbs than they did in rural or urban areas, as defined by the census. And if you think about jobs, and I mentioned, technology jobs, defense jobs, NASA jobs. If you think about that in the 20th century, from World War I on, you look at the numbers of jobs created, far more jobs were created in suburban communities than were created in inner cities. Now, let's step back just a moment and add another element very quickly, and that's the inner city. You remember we talked about the Great Migration and the movement of African Americans out of the Deep South to industrial cities in the northern United States. Remember that there, African Americans found more opportunity, but they still faced issues of segregation, Jim Crow, and they struggled to maintain their rights. By 1966, 69% of African Americans lived in metropolitan areas, 45% outside the South. Unemployment among African Americans was nearly double that of whites. But that business of segregation, right, it goes to this business of unemployment. So African Americans are moving to cities, but they're facing higher unemployment, they're facing segregation. 1950s to 1960s, the migration continues. 2.5 million African Americans moved from southern farms to northern cities. You start thinking about what's happening here, and I could tell you a real quick story about Chicago, Illinois. What begins to happen is that as African Americans move in to the west side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago, other groups, including former immigrants, begin to move out. Sometimes the term that's used is white flight. So why, you ask, don't African Americans begin to spread out into the newly growing suburbs? And the answer is often they can't. They face higher unemployment, but they also face discriminatory practices even within the lending institutions of the federal government. I mentioned earlier the Federal Housing Authority. From the 1930s through the late 1960s, the Federal Housing Authority drew on maps of Chicago red lines. And they simply would not lend to African Americans who wished to move across those red lines into areas dominated by non-African Americans. Thus, what you're doing is ultimately holding back access to capital, making it almost impossible for African Americans to spread out within the geography of a city. Also, among other people, real estate agents and whole neighborhoods used covenants attached to deeds, covenant deeds, which prevented whites from selling to non-whites. You couldn't sell you accept the covenant deed, it prevents you, arguably, from selling to non-whites, those who are excluded under the contractual agreement of the deed. And the problems of the inner cities, as more and more African Americans and more immigrants make their way in, will continue to grow. That's why we see that huge unemployment. It's why, in part, we see the rioting that we do in the mid-1960s. The very rioting that leads Republican Richard Nixon to base his campaign on promises of law and order, and question, of course, the validity of government, federal government, national government. But here's the last sort of element in the puzzle. When these African Americans from the South move north seeking employment, facing segregation, it's the wealthiest whites who are able to leave first. The people often left behind to deal with or confront new populations and compete for industrial jobs, which, think about it, those jobs are increasingly not in the cities but in the suburbs. They're increasingly not in the northern industrial or rust belt. They're moving south, or they're beginning to move offshore. There are not as many good industrial jobs in the 1960s and 70s as there might have been earlier. You're competing for jobs, you're competing for living space, you're competing not to be the lowest on the rung, or on the lowest rung of the ladder. That's not the wealthy elite. It's not even the sort of middle-class professional oftentimes. It is the blue-collar worker. And so part of the deal here is that both Wallace and Nixon are playing for the support of these former Democrats. These are union people. These are organized labor people. They're industrial workers, whites, many times immigrants. That's the population that they're playing for in different ways. But it's not just the silent majority. It's not just the middle class. But part of that silent majority is the blue-collar worker. I just had a thought which I'll mention, and then I'll end this segment. And I hope I haven't confused you too much. I really want to try and bring all this together. I was hoping to make it more understandable, sort of what are the mechanics, what are the dynamics happening beneath this election of '68 and the emergence of this new conservatism. But I remember when I was quite young, I remember a show which you may have heard of, All in the Family. And one of the chief characters is Archie Bunker, played by Carol O'Connor. And, that show was truly reflective of its times, in that Archie Bunker represents many of the sort of characteristics of the blue-collar worker living in the city and watching what appears to be a decline, watching change occur all around, so that the foundations of what you take for granted as natural are questioned. They're called into question. But being ultimately incapable of doing much to stop the change and incapable of getting out of its way, while others, those with more wealth or more power, could simply move. That's the crux of the American situation, sort of in the late 1960s. And I think, we'll leave it there. Pick up with the next segment. We'll talk about the Nixon presidency, and we'll move on with that.